United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Because sometimes I feel like saying amen after that pledge. It means that much to me. It's like a prayer. When I graduated from high school, my best friend Ron and I, we were almost like brothers, inseparable. So now what? We graduated from high school. What do we do now? Work? Can't go to school. Neither of our parents could afford to put us through school. So we thought about it for a while, and the topic of the military came up. And after discussing the pros and cons, we said, all right, let's do that. Let's sign up. So I said, okay, Ron, let's go to the Air Force. He said, no, Gail, let's do the Navy. Ron, Air Force, Navy. Now, whatever we were going to do, we were going to do it together. We were that close. So we flipped a coin. And it came up Navy. So we were in the Navy. Now this was after World War II and before Vietnam. So neither of us saw any action. Ron, as a matter of fact, never even got aboard ship. Whereas I spent 3 of my 4 years aboard a destroyer, the USS Mullenix DD-944. The closest I came to combat, however, was when I was in the blockade of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The most excitement I experienced was one night, February of 1965. We were on an anti-submarine mission where we were seeking to find a submarine. I was aboard the destroyer. I was on the radar scope. I was also manning the phones, the radio phones, to a helicopter and guiding the helicopter to a certain location where he would drop his bathoscope and try to find the submarine. Suddenly, that helicopter just disappeared from my radar scope, and it had crashed into the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. I had the bearing and ranges to that helicopter, and I kept relaying them to the captain as he moved the ship closer and closer, because even though we were a mile away, we were the closest ship to that downed aircraft. Now at 40-degree temperature of the water, the airmen had about 30 minutes to live. So expedience was very important. As we got close to them with the ship, we lowered a boat into the water, and the crew in the boat went about picking up the sailors. One by one, we picked them up, and they weren't real close together. So the last sailor, airman from the helicopter, didn't get picked up until he'd been in the water for 30 minutes. He was very cold. Matter of fact, we had to treat him for hypothermia when we got him aboard ship. But all crew members of the Mullenix received a commendation for our quick action in picking up these 4 crewmen. In September of 2009, I attended the ship's reunion in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. One of my friends came to me and says, "Weren't you on the Mullenix when they picked up the people from the downed aircraft?" I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I was on the radar scope that night." My friend said to me, "Come here, I want you to meet somebody." A man had driven from San Antonio, Texas to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he was the 4th airman picked up from that helicopter. He wanted to personally thank us for saving his life. And that was the greatest moment of my military career. Yes, I am a veteran, and November 11th means something to me. I will also admit to getting choked up when I hear the national anthem and the Pledge of Allegiance is recited. Now, it may be hard for you to believe, but I was once a 12-year-old, like many of you, wondering what this Veterans Day stuff was. I wore my poppy that Mom and Dad had bought for me, proudly displayed in a buttonhole of my shirt. Now, the poppy is a symbol of support for the veterans of World War I. World War I. The war to end all wars, as it was known in the early 20th century, but it did not end all wars as we know. It was a brutal, bloody war that cost the lives of many men in England, France, Germany, and the United States, as well as many other countries embroiled in that conflict. In Washington, D.C., we can find memorials to the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam Memorial, but here in Kansas City, we have the only national memorial to World War I. In 1914, an assassination by a single dissident grew into a bitter conflict that became known as World War I. Ultimately, it was primarily the Germans against the British and the French. Now, ancient strategies called for the armies to line up against an open field, facing one another and charging each other and trying to hack or to stab or kill each other, and the strongest army would win. But modern technology had produced rapid-fire weapons and repeating rifles. Thus, both the allies of the British and the French and the Germans soon realized that standing face to face with the enemy cost many lives on both sides, and they began to dig trenches for cover. Soon the trenches, from 50 to 200 yards apart, had become 6 to 8 feet deep and covered a line of nearly 400 miles on the western boundary of France. Now protected, the fighting bogged down to an occasional shot from one or both sides, infrequent and ineffective charges toward the enemy, and inaccurate aerial bombing attempts. Also in 1914, a young man in his late teens was struggling as a sharecropper in the eastern Tennessee mountains. A sharecropper in the mountains leads a very difficult life trying to provide for a family. But Alvin York was determined. Because he had to share half of the fruits of his labor with the owner of the land, that left little for Alvin and his family. The sparse rocky soil on the mountain begrudgingly yielded crops, and, adding to the difficulty, Alvin's father had passed away this spring, leaving Alvin to care for his mother, 2 younger sisters, and a baby brother. By necessity, Alvin learned to shoot very well, and so well that his rifle, he would shoot the head off a turkey rather than damage the meaty portion. While not plowing, planting, or tending the few pigs and the lone cow, Alvin would take his horse higher into the mountain in search of deer and game to provide food for the winter months. Alvin dreamed of saving enough money to put a down payment on some bottom land desired by many. Fertile land below the Rocky Mountain soil that could yield bumper crops. As the war raged on in Europe, Alvin York scrimped and saved on the mountain as his reputation with a rifle spread. In 1917, the United States entered the conflict and sent notices to eligible men to enlist in the armed forces. The Army drafted Alvin, but he says, "I ain't gonna go." The Army says, "Well, wait a minute, you have to go." Again, Alvin says, "No, I am not gonna go. The good book says thou shalt not kill, and I ain't gonna kill anybody." You see, Alvin was a very deeply religious man. But the Army wouldn't take no for an answer and insisted that he join. But they allowed him to enter as a conscientious objector, which means he wouldn't have to kill anybody. The stalemated trench warfare between the Allies and the Germans had evolved into a series of futile attempts on both sides to occasionally jump out of their trench and charge toward the opposing trenches. The British and French officers would order their men, "Go get them, charge over those Germans and kill them." Well, they'd get out of their trench and they'd start running across no man's land, and the Germans would start shooting them down, and the British and French would run back to their trench and say, "That was stupid." And pretty soon the German officers would say, "Charge across the field, get those Allies." The German soldiers would jump up out of the trench, run across the field, but they would start getting shot down, and they'd turn around and run back to their trench and say, "Wow, that was stupid." All it attempts to overwhelm the opposition were met with withering fire and considerable loss of life. This stalemate lasted for nearly 3 years, with little gain by either side. Into this breach, Alvin and his American company were thrown. It was time for the fresh American soldiers to take their turn charging the opposite trench, and Alvin and his company were ordered out of the safe cover into no man's land and ran toward the German lines. With soldiers falling all around them at an alarming rate, Alvin and his squad took cover in a bomb crater and watched helplessly as exposed men were mercilessly shot down. With bullets flying overhead, Alvin began to crawl on his belly, parallel to the trenches, until he reached a position near the end of the German line. He began to shoot down the soldiers, one at a time, until they raised a white flag of surrender. Alvin then ordered them to get up out of the trench and march toward the Allied lines. Now the Allies honored the white flag of surrender and watched in awe as Alvin York single-handedly marched 140 German soldiers toward the Allied commanders. Alvin's commanding officers were dumbfounded and questioning, "Alvin, you're a conscientious objector. You have vowed not to kill, yet you killed single-handedly 25 German soldiers and captured 140 more. Why? How is this possible?" "Well, sir," Alvin began, "it was a killing my friends, and I had to do something." The commanding officer looked at him and says, "You mean to tell me that in order to stop them from killing our men, you killed them?" "Yes, sir." Alvin was a very humble man. The amazed commanders recommended Alvin for many awards, and he was given the highest honors the British and the French governments could bestow. The United States Congress bestowed upon Alvin York its highest award, the Congressional Medal of Honor. Alvin was brought back to the United States, and the people of New York honored him with a ticker-tape parade. The mayor of New York City gave him the key to the city. The people of Tennessee honored their favorite son by giving Alvin and his family a prime piece of bottomland, where Alvin happily lived out his days in peace. There's kind of a little side story to World War I that may be somewhere between truth and legend. As the story has it, on Christmas Day of 1915, an unofficial truce was called to celebrate Christmas. As the French and British soldiers sat quietly in their cold trenches, eating a meager Christmas dinner, a familiar melody wafted over no man's land between enemy trenches. They did not understand the words, for they were in German, but they did understand the melody. Soon, many in the Allied trenches joined in the singing of Silent Night. An invitation was voiced, and many of the combatants rose out of the trenches and cautiously approached one another in the battle-scarred ground between the enemy forces. German, French, and British soldiers exchanged handshakes and what little food they had, and together sang hymns and carols in praise of the birth of Jesus Christ. For a couple of hours, enemies laughed and sang together, putting the war behind them as best they could. Too soon, it came time to return to their respective lines, and the battles began again. Men who had shared Christmas cheered, now, once again, trying to kill the other. No, World War I was not the war to end all wars. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed Congress December 7, 1941, a date that will live in infamy. These words were broadcast to the nation over the radio waves. Thousands of young men heard these words, rose up and cried, "They can't do that to us. The Japanese can't bomb Pearl Harbor and get away with it. We'll show them," and rushed to recruiting stations. Such a young man was Audie Murphy, a 16-year-old boy from West Texas. Now, a young man of 17 Ken joined the military with his parents' signed permission, but Audie was only 16. When Audie went to the naval recruiter and lied about his age, he was laughed at. The Marine recruiter also laughed. "You're too little for the Marines, boy. Get out of here. We want men." You see, Audie Murphy was not a big boy. Stood maybe 5'5" tall. Doubted if he weighed 110 pounds, but he was very determined. He would take no for an answer. He would not take no for an answer. And the Army recruiter finally gave in and said, "Okay, you're in the Army." But Audie was not sent to the Pacific Theater to fight the Japanese. He was sent to Tunisia in North Africa, where he did not see action. Later, landing on the shores of Italy, now Sergeant Murphy, Audie would finally see combat. He and his squad were on patrol when a pair of German soldiers were waving a white flag, preparing to take the surrendering soldiers into tow. The squad approached when suddenly a concealed machine gun opened fire, as did the surrendering pair of soldiers. Caught in an ambush, Audie's squad suffered many casualties, including Audie's best friend. Sergeant Murphy shot down the soldiers faking surrender and charged the machine gun nest, dispatching the Germans there. Then, raising that German's machine gun to his hip, he charged 2 other machine gun nests, killing them as well. Audie Murphy was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for this action. Early in 1945, Lieutenant Murphy was leading his company of 120 men, supported by 2 tanks in western Belgium, when they were surprised by 3 companies of Germans with 6 Tiger tanks. Audie's 2 tanks took out 4 of the Tigers before they were in turn blown out of the water. Now Audie ordered his troops, his company, to safety before he leaped aboard one of the U.S. tanks and began to use its .50 caliber gun to shoot down the German soldiers. He leaped to safety seconds before the remaining Tigers blew his tank out from under him. Audie then leaped aboard the nearest Tiger as he used a submachine gun to ward off the German soldiers, and by dropping a grenade down the hatch of the tank, disabled it. Still firing his machine gun, Audie leaped aboard a second Tiger and disabled it as well. Ordering his company to advance, they overwhelmed the Germans. For his actions, Audie Murphy was awarded the highest honor the United States can award a military hero, the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was brought back to the United States and celebrated as a hero, complete with ticker tape parades in front of adoring crowds. Hollywood adored him as well, for Audie was a good-looking young man that had grown to almost 5'8" tall and a muscular 160 pounds. In 1955, Audie Murphy starred in the movie production of his story, To Hell and Back. But Audie seemed to be at best riding a horse in westerns, and starred in very many. In almost all of his movies, Audie's co-stars were taller than him. Frequently, close-up shots featured Audie standing on a box to appear bigger than the co-star. Yes, he was not a big man, but in the annals of military history, not many approached the stature of Audie Murphy. Now, when we think of World War II, the Holocaust comes to mind. Hitler's hatred for the Jews, his attempted genocide in the camps of Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Treblinka, and others. The Jews taken from their homes, loaded into railway cars, and taken to concentration camps, where a terrible fate awaited them. The soldiers that liberated these camps could tell you that they lived with nightmares for the rest of their lives. Oh, those nasty Nazis. This could never happen in any other country. Oh no. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, started the United States involvement in World War II. On December 8th, the Japanese continued their assault on the islands of the Pacific and invaded the Philippines. The modest forces of the Philippine Islands bravely held off the vastly superior numbers of Japanese soldiers until April 9th, 1942, when their ammunition, their food, and medical supplies were totally depleted. No longer able to fight, the 76,000 American and Philippine sick and starving forces reluctantly surrendered at the tip of the Bataan Peninsula. Now, the Japanese considered surrender dishonorable and looked upon the surrendered prisoners with contempt and worse. General Masahiro Homma was in charge of the Japanese army in the Philippines and did not enforce the order to treat the detainees fairly. The sick and malnourished U.S. and Philippine forces began trudging the 65 miles to the railhead destination of San Fernando. They did not understand the insults being hurled at them as they began the trek, but they did understand they were being spit upon, and worse. An Air Force captain was searched by a Japanese private who discovered Japanese yen in the officer's pocket. Raising an alarm, the private alerted a Japanese officer who, with a quick swipe of his samurai sword, decapitated the U.S. officer. The captain's head seemed to jump off his shoulders, according to one eyewitness account. As the sun rose in the sky, the soldiers that had not had food for several days grew thirsty and begged for water. As one soldier raised his canteen to his lips, a Japanese soldier grabbed it, and the other canteens, pouring the contents into his horse's nose bag so that his horse could drink water. The Japanese soldiers laughed at the thirsty Americans. Seeing water in the ditch alongside the road, one American soldier bent down to catch a handful of water and was quickly beheaded, to the delight of the enemy troops. Well, surely they would not do that again. But as another GI stooped down near the ditch, he too was beheaded. Nearly 5,000 U.S. and Philippine soldiers did escape to the surrounding area to wage warfare on their oppressors, but very many were killed in the attempts to escape. Many that were caught even looking toward the wooded area were unmercifully clubbed and beaten. The weakened soldiers were prodded by the Imperial forces in an attempt to get them moving more quickly. Many that fell were bayoneted. Finally, the ditch widened into a thick, muddy pond occupied by a water buffalo. The Japanese soldiers laughed as they forced the prisoners to drink this water. Many that did drink later died from the diseases contained in the putrid urine and feces contaminated water. At midday, the Japanese herded their prisoners into a clearing in full view of the blazing sun to increase the suffering. Once the march continued, those too weak to march were left alongside the road where Japanese cleanup crews would shoot or bayonet them. Some were simply run over by the Japanese troop trucks. By the time they finished their 65-mile trek, less than 60,000 were loaded into solid wooden boxcars waiting on the rails. More than 100 prisoners were tightly packed into the cars that could normally hold about 50 until they stood shoulder to shoulder, unable to move. Dehydrated and malnourished, the soldiers had to endure stifling heat in unventilated cars, as well as the stench from their comrades' bodies. It took several hours to load over 55,000 men into the rail cars, but finally they were on the move. Men were unable to move or to find a private place to relieve themselves. If they felt it necessary to relieve themselves, they had no choice but to do so against the men next to them. Soon the smell of body odor was overwhelmed by the stench of human urine and feces. As the train reached its destination near Camp O'Donnell, the soldiers were finally able to disembark and reveal what they already knew. Many prisoners had died in the rail car, but were unable to fall to the floor, being held upright by the man next to them. The dead were roughly dragged out of the car. The American people did not learn of the circumstances of the march from Bataan for 2 years, until 3 Army officers escaped Camp O'Donnell and told the authorities. After the surrender of the Japanese Imperial forces, General Masahiro Homa was captured, tried for war crimes against the men of Bataan, and faced a firing squad for his actions. Those that survived the 65-mile Bataan death march and the cruel trade right were prisoners of war in Camp O'Donnell, where meager provisions could not prevent the loss of 30 to 50 that died daily. The survivors of the march and the imprisonment at Camp O'Donnell became known as the Battling Bastards of Bataan. Well, you might say, that was our enemies. Nothing like that can happen here in the United States. We're too civilized to do anything like that. Are you sure? Have you ever heard of Andersonville? It is important that we do remember the Holocaust, but we don't want to remember the atrocities of the Andersonville prison camp in Georgia during the American Civil War. But they happened, and they were harsh indeed. Captain Wirtz was in charge of the camp, opened in early 1864. A camp designed to hold 10,000 prisoners, but filled to over 30,000 near year's end. The 16-acre site, chosen because of its good source of water, was soon overflowing with Union soldiers that tried desperately to make the best of a horrendous situation. A single small creek flowing through the compound, intended to provide drinking water, was soon contaminated with human waste. Without enough food or clean water to accommodate the number behind the wooden stockades, many Union soldiers succumbed to disease or starvation. Inside the 16-acre site, surrounded by tight-fitting pine log stockade walls, was a light fence 20 to 25 feet inside the pine logs, called a dead wall. For any unfortunate soldier caught between the wall and the wire fence was immediately shot. This deterrent proved highly successful, as the few that attempted to broach the sturdy stockade walls were soon buried by their comrades. To make matters worse, a criminal element among the Union soldiers, the Raiders, roamed freely about the camp, looting food and valuables from fellow soldiers too weak to fight back. Eventually, a second group, known as the Regulators, rounded up the Raiders and put them on trial for crimes against their fellow soldiers. Punishment for the guilty ranged from wearing a ball and chain up to hanging. 6 of the Raiders were thus summarily executed. The Union prisoners held on to hope that they would be exchanged for Southern prisoners and thus be freed from the atrocious conditions at Andersonville Prison. An incident at Fort Pillow in April dashed any hope that a prisoner exchange would take place. In response to the massacre of black Union soldiers at Fort Pillow, President Lincoln demanded that black prisoners be treated the same as white prisoners. Confederate President Jefferson Davis refused. President Lincoln and General Grant then suspended all prisoner exchanges. By June at Andersonville, the population had exceeded 20,000, and the harsh conditions were exacerbated. By August, that number ballooned to 33,000. The men exposed to the unbearable heat of southern Georgia suffered from various diseases and malnutrition. The soldiers died at a rate of 100 per day. Fearing an attack by Union General Sherman as he moved on Atlanta, Captain Wirtz moved the prisoners at Andersonville to other camps. When the attack by Sherman on the camp did not materialize, about 5,000 prisoners were returned to Andersonville, and that population remained practically unchanged until the end of the Civil War in April 1865. Captain Wirtz was tried at war's end for allowing inhumane conditions at Andersonville and hanged. Now I love stories about heroes, especially stories that are of heroes that are not well known of. Now, how many of you have heard about Sybil Ludington? Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Thus begins a William Wordsworth Longfellow poem about the Revolutionary War hero. His ride is an event to commemorate and celebrate as an important event in the success of the American Revolution. But the ride of Sybil Ludington was more than twice as long and much more dangerous. It is 1777, and America is fighting for independence from England. Sybil's father is a colonel in the Connecticut militia and leads a force of over 400 men who had recently been allowed to go home for spring planting. Now, Sybil wished she could do more for the revolutionary cause, but she was a little girl, just barely 16. Suddenly, from her bedroom, she heard the sound of a horse galloping into the yard. Just past 9 o'clock in the evening, as her father rushes out to hear a messenger cry, "The British are attacking Danbury, and all our supplies stored there." Then the messenger collapsed from exhaustion. "We must gather the militia," Colonel Ludington exclaimed to no one in particular. "But how will we alert them? The messenger is much too exhausted to continue his ride." "I will do it," said Sybil. "No, my dear, no. You are too young and is much too dangerous. There are British soldiers all along the route, as well as men still loyal to the crown. But Sybil, worst of all, there are robbers and evil men along the route that will kill you just to see if you have anything of value. No, you cannot go." "But father—" Sybil pleaded relentlessly until her father, desperate to inform his men and having no other alternative, relented. Going into the house, Colonel Ludington returned holding a heavy cane with a large knob on its top. Bidding his beloved daughter to exercise caution, the colonel said, "This is a recognizable symbol of my authority. Use this to pound on the doors of our men. Bid them hurry. Godspeed, my beloved." And he kissed her goodbye. With her heart pounding, Sybil rode hard to the homes of the militiamen, banging on their doors with the knob of the heavy cane. "The British are attacking Danbury! Muster at Ludington's mill!" This message was repeated several times. As Sybil rode through the dark woods, a horse and rider suddenly came alongside. The rider reached for the bridle of Sybil's horse, but she swung the heavy cane with all her might, knocking their rider from his horse. Sybil did not turn back to see if the man had been hurt, but continued her furious ride, alerting many more. Finally, just before dawn, a weary little girl, barely 16, returned to Ludington's mill to see it swarming with men. Her proud and relieved father embraced his daughter. She had ridden for nearly 9 hours and covered more than 40 miles and contributed mightily to the revolutionary cause. There's one more hero I'd like to tell you about. I had heard the story about Lowell Benson being in the outpost in the jungles of New Guinea in 1944. I knew about how his camp was overrun by the Japanese and how the man in his foxhole was shot and killed. I also was told about how he played dead in hopes the Japanese troops would leave and he could live. Private Lowell Benson watched in horror as the Japanese soldiers began to bayonet the bodies of the men in his platoon to ensure that they were dead. He watched in dread as the enemy soldiers came ever closer to him, and in great relief when American forces came to the rescue and forced the enemy to retreat. Lowell was shaken as he and the 4 other survivors from his platoon greeted the saving troops with great thanks and appreciation. Later, back at base camp in New Guinea, and reunited with his brother Lyle, Lowell Benson related the story of his horrifying encounter and never spoke of it again. Curious about the details of the event, at dinner one evening, I asked my father-in-law, Lowell Benson, if he would elaborate on the event. The father of my wife quietly looked at his plate, set his fork down gently, and walked out of the room. We have all heard of the condition PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, where a combat soldier comes home and cannot live with the horror he witnessed during combat. It is a popular theme in movies and on television. How a returning soldier cannot cope and commits a crime against self or others. Almost all returning veterans of combat have memories that haunt them. Most deal with the memories and live normal lives. But for a few, the sights and sounds of war is more than they can bear. My father-in-law lived with his memories and kept them to himself. Bull Benson was not a large man, standing only 5'8" tall and maybe 150 pounds. But in my eyes, he was a very big man. Now all these people share one thing in common. They were all veterans that fought for the principles of freedom we enjoy here in the United States. Many gave their lives in defense of those freedoms. Freedoms we take for granted too often. Today I ask you to think of a family member who has served in one of the branches of our military, whether past or present. Their sacrifice, if not in battle, in the separation from family and loved ones, is one they do with pride. Share your pride in that family member or an anonymous soldier as we honor them each year on November 11th. For it was at the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month, that the war to end all wars did finally end.